Welcome to Should Have Known It, where we present 15-minute videos of things you definitely should have known. Hi, welcome to Shoulda Known It. I'm Aoki, and today's topic is Show Me the Incentive. Let's start with your house. You hire an agent, and you assume that because they earn a percentage of the sale price, their interests are perfectly aligned with yours. Higher sale price, bigger commission, you both win, right? This is the assumption almost every homeowner makes, and it is almost entirely wrong. Here's the actual arithmetic. The standard US commission is around 5 to 6%, split between buyers and sellers agents. So your agent takes roughly 3%. If your house is listed at $400,000 and you get an offer for $380,000, your agent earns $11,400. If you push back and eventually land at $420,000, a full $40,000 more for you, your agent earns $12,600. That's $1,200 more for them, in exchange for potentially weeks of additional work, open houses, negotiations, and stress. Economists Stephen Levitt and Chad Syverson actually studied this in 2008, pulling transaction data from Chicago. When real estate agents sold their own personal homes, not a client's house, their own, those homes sat on the market an average of 10 days longer and sold for about 3.7% more than comparable client homes. The agents weren't incompetent when selling client homes. They were rational. The incentive said, close fast. And this isn't a story about dishonest agents. It's a story about what even honest, well-meaning people do when the incentive structure nudges them a certain direction. Most agents aren't consciously thinking, I'll shortchange my client. They're thinking, a decent offer is on the table. Why drag this out? The incentive shapes the framing before the reasoning even starts. Now let's talk about the most expensive example in American life, healthcare. The dominant payment model in US medicine is called fee-for-service. Doctors and hospitals get paid per procedure, per test, per visit. The more things they do, the more they earn. And you will not be surprised to learn that this produces a very specific kind of outcome. The United States spends roughly 17% of its GDP on healthcare, about double what most comparable wealthy nations spend, while ranking last or near last on outcomes like life expectancy and chronic disease management among those same nations. The Dartmouth Atlas Project, which tracked Medicare spending for decades, found that patients in high-spending regions don't live longer or healthier lives than patients in lower-spending regions. They just receive more procedures. A landmark 2012 study in the Journal of the American Medical Association estimated that about $750 billion of annual U.S. healthcare spending, roughly 30 cents of every dollar, was waste. That included unnecessary services, inefficiently delivered care, and excessive administrative costs. Not malpractice, not fraud. Waste that emerges naturally when the incentive structure rewards volume over value. The fix that's been tried is something called capitation or value-based care, paying doctors a flat fee per patient per year regardless of how many procedures happen. In theory, this realigns the incentive. Keep the patient healthy because you're paid either way. The Kaiser Permanente model in California runs roughly this way, and it consistently outperforms fee-for-service peers on preventive care metrics. But capitation has its own trap. It creates an incentive to avoid sick patients entirely, because they cost more to care for. Change the incentive, and you change the outcome, sometimes in a new direction you didn't expect. Here's one from Silicon Valley that engineers find darkly funny. In the early days of software performance reviews, and this still happens at some companies today, managers measured productivity by lines of code written. The logic seemed reasonable. More code, more work done. The outcome was predictable to anyone who'd thought it through for 30 seconds. Engineers wrote verbose, redundant, over-engineered code. Problems that could be solved in 20 elegant lines got solved in 200 sprawling ones. Functions that called other functions that called other functions, not because the architecture required it, but because the metric rewarded it. There's a famous internal story at Apple, probably apocryphal but widely believed, that Steve Jobs once measured the Mac's software team by a different metric: lines of code deleted. Because in software, removing code, making something simpler, is often the hardest and most valuable work. This is the pattern that shows up again and again. You pick a measurable proxy for the thing you actually want. The proxy gets optimized hard in ways that disconnect it from the original goal. The sociologist Donald Campbell formalized this in 1976. The more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor. It's now called Campbell's Law, and it's one of the most reliably verified patterns in organizational behavior. The wild corollary of Campbell's Law is that measurement itself can be destructive. British colonial administrators in India, trying to reduce the cobra population in Delhi, offered a bounty per dead cobra. Locals started breeding cobras to collect the bounty. When the program was canceled, the breeders released their now worthless snakes, and the cobra population went up. This is called the cobra effect, and it's not ancient history. Versions of this happen in corporate KPIs, government policy, and school testing regimes every single year. Let's make this concrete with one of the most vivid modern examples, Wells Fargo 2016. The bank had, for years, set aggressive cross-selling targets. The goal was for each customer to hold an average of 8 financial products with the bank: accounts, credit cards, loans, everything. The internal slogan was literally 8 is great. Branch managers and tellers were evaluated on this number. Over a period of roughly 14 years, bank employees opened approximately 3.5 million unauthorized accounts and credit cards in customers' names without their knowledge or consent. Customers were charged fees on accounts they didn't know existed. Credit scores were damaged. When the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau investigated and the story broke publicly, Wells Fargo paid $185 million in initial fines, a number that later grew into the billions as additional investigations unfolded. More than 5,300 employees were fired. Here is the part that should stop you cold. The bank fired the employees and called it a bad apples problem. But 5,300 people is not a bad apples problem. 5,300 people across branches in dozens of states over 14 years is a systemic response to a systemic incentive. The employees who cheated were responding rationally to what the institution was rewarding. The CEO, John Stumpf, who presided over the entire era, initially kept his job. A better designed incentive structure, say measuring customer satisfaction scores or account usage rates rather than sheer account counts, would not have created saints out of the same employees. It simply would have pointed their rational behavior in a less destructive direction. The character of the people mattered less than the architecture of the system. This is where Munger's line has its most important practical implication. We tend to explain bad institutional behavior through moral categories: greed, corruption, negligence. And sometimes that's right, but very often, you're looking at ordinary people responding predictably to what they're being rewarded for. The error is structural, not personal, which means the fix has to be structural too. Think about how we typically respond when an institution fails. We fire someone. We run a training on ethics. We issue a press release about values. What we almost never do is sit down and ask, what exactly are we measuring and paying for, and what behavior does that logically produce? The Wells Fargo response was instructive. The bank ran ethics training for its branch staff. Ethics training for people whose direct manager was threatening them about their account counts. Ethics training cannot overpower a compensation structure. This is not cynicism. It is basic cognitive science. When extrinsic rewards are large enough and consistent enough, they reliably crowd out intrinsic motivation. It's been replicated in study after study since Deci and Ryan's foundational self-determination theory work in the 1970s. You cannot lecture your way out of a misaligned incentive. You have to change what you're paying for. Academia is worth its own section because it produces one of the most structurally elegant incentive failures you can study. Universities are ostensibly in the business of teaching students and advancing human knowledge, but the currency that determines whether a professor gets hired, promoted, and tenured is not teaching quality, it is publications in peer-reviewed journals. This produces a research system that is optimized for publication count rather than for true discovery. The result is well documented. An estimated 52% of psychology research findings failed to replicate in the Open Science Collaboration's landmark 2015 study. Similar replication crises have been found in cancer biology, economics, and nutrition research. Not because the scientists are frauds, most aren't, but because the system rewards publishing positive findings, not null results. Journals don't want "we tested this and nothing happened." Journals want breakthroughs. This creates what's called publication bias. A dozen labs might test the same compound and find no effect. One lab finds a weak positive result and publishes it. The literature now contains one study supporting the compound and zero against it because the zeros are sitting in file drawers. Drug companies, nutritional supplement makers, and self help gurus all fish from this same biased pond. The incentive to publish positive findings doesn't just distort academia, it distorts everything downstream. And for teaching. A 2011 analysis in the Review of Higher Education found that at research universities, teaching evaluations had essentially no relationship to promotion decisions. A professor could be consistently rated as one of the worst instructors in their department and face zero career consequence for it, provided their publication record was strong. The incentive was transparent. Students weren't the product, they were the funding mechanism. There's a version of this framework that turns cynical fast. Everyone is just self-interested. Nothing means anything. That's not what Munger was saying, and it's not what the evidence supports. The insight isn't that people are bad, it's that even good people operating inside a badly designed system will produce bad outcomes, and no amount of moralizing will fix it. The constructive version of the framework is a question you can ask of any institution. What is this system actually measuring and rewarding right now in the day-to-day experience of the people inside it? Not what it says it values in its mission statement, not what the founder intended. What behavior does it concretely and consistently reward? Because that behavior is what you will reliably get at scale over time. Amazon in its early years had customer service reps evaluated partly on how quickly they resolved calls. Faster calls, better metrics. The incentive said, end the call. So reps were incentivized to give partial answers or transfer customers or simply wrap things up before the problem was actually solved. Jeff Bezos reportedly changed the metric to first contact resolution. Did the customer's problem get solved on the first contact? Full stop. The behavior changed. The same people, the same customers, the same phones, different incentive, different outcome. So here's how you actually use this. When you see an institution behaving in a way that seems irrational or self-defeating, don't start with malice. Start with incentives. Ask three things. Who gets paid or promoted based on this behavior? What exactly are they being measured on? And what does rational self-interest look like inside that measurement system? You'll find it everywhere once you're looking. Quarterly earnings pressure pushes executives toward share buybacks that boost this quarter's numbers at the expense of long-term R&D investment, because the compensation package is tied to stock price today, not in a decade. Insurance adjusters who are measured on claim denial rates will find reasons to deny claims. Teachers in schools with high-stakes, standardized testing will teach to the test, because the test is what their evaluation rests on. None of these people are uniquely villainous. There's also an important personal dimension here. You are not immune. If your employer measures you on one thing, you will, consciously or not, orient your work toward that one thing, even if you privately believe something else matters more. Understanding this doesn't make you cynical, it makes you more honest about how you and everyone around you actually operate. Self-awareness about your own incentive structure is the closest thing to a superpower this framework offers. The final and honestly humbling thing about Munger's framework is how hard it is to design good incentives, even when you're explicitly trying. Volkswagen's diesel engineers were given targets for fuel economy and emissions performance. They met those targets through a defeat device that detected emissions tests and temporarily cleaned up the engine's output while driving normally. The car polluted up to 40 times the legal nitrogen oxide limit. The engineers were responsive to their incentives. The incentive designers hadn't anticipated the full solution space. The Cobra effect returns again and again. Every time you try to measure something important and attach a reward to it, you have changed the relationship between the measure and the thing you care about. This is not a counsel of despair. Some incentive structures are much better than others, and the effort to improve them is genuinely worth making. But it should make you humble about the gap between what you intend to reward and what you're actually rewarding. The most robust systems tend to be ones where people are measured on multiple dimensions simultaneously, where gaming one dimension produces a visible cost in another, and where feedback loops are tight enough that misalignment gets caught fast rather than compounding for 14 years. That's not a complete solution, it's more like a design direction, but it starts with taking the question seriously. Before you hire a professional, a realtor, a contractor, a financial advisor, take 5 minutes and map their incentive structure. How exactly do they make more money? What metric is their performance judged against? Is their financial interest aligned with your desired outcome? Or just roughly in the same direction? A fee-only financial advisor who charges a flat hourly rate has a very different incentive structure than one who earns commissions on the products they sell you. Both can be honest people. One of them has to try harder to be. At the organizational level, the most valuable thing you can do is find out what your institution actually measures, not what it says it values, but what data gets pulled, what gets reported to leadership, and what concretely affects promotions and bonuses. There's a divergence in almost every organization between the stated values and the operational metrics. And that gap tells you more about how the place actually works than any mission statement ever will. The framework isn't cynical because it doesn't say people are bad. It says people respond to systems, and systems can be designed better or worse. That's fundamentally an optimistic idea. It means things can change, not by finding better people, but by building better structures. That's the real lesson Munger spent 50 years trying to teach. We're out of time, but seriously, the next time you look at an institution doing something baffling, don't ask how could they. Ask what are they paid for. The answer will be right there. I'll see you next class. And that brings us to the end. Thank you for joining me and learning something new. Until next time, click like and subscribe.